Imagine breaking your leg and surviving for 40 more years. No x-ray, no antibiotics, no surgeon, just a forest, a few plants, and a tribe that refuse to let you die. Sounds impossible, right? Modern medicine has convinced us that without hospitals, humanity would have vanished within a generation. But here's the twist nobody tells you. Our ancestors weren't helpless cavemen waiting to die from a scratch. They were the original biohackers, running thousands of years of trial and error experiments long before anyone wrote the word science. Skeletons dug up from 7,000 years ago show skull surgeries called trepanation. Yes, ancient humans drilled holes into living human heads. And shockingly, many patients survived and the bone healed around the hole. Why would anyone drill into a skull on purpose? Some believe it released pressure from head injuries. Others think it was meant to release evil spirits, causing seizures or madness. Either way, it worked often enough that the practice spread across continents, from Peru to France to ancient China, independently invented by people who never met each other. And it wasn't just the brain they tampered with. Ancient Egyptians were stitching wounds with linen thread soaked in honey, a substance we now know is naturally antibacterial because it starves bacteria of the moisture they need to survive. They didn't have microscopes to see germs, but they noticed something we almost forgot. Infected wounds healed faster near beehives than battlefields. Observation was their laboratory. Across the world, in the Amazon rainforest, indigenous tribes were identifying which of the 40,000 plant species around them could stop bleeding, kill pain, or cure fevers. Knowledge, so advanced that nearly 25% of modern pharmaceutical drugs are still derived from plants first, discovered by these very communities. Quinine, used today to treat malaria, was first extracted from cinchona tree bark by indigenous South Americans centuries before any European scientist isolated its compound. But here's where it gets even stranger. Ancient Chinese physicians were performing a primitive form of vaccination over 1,000 years before Edward Jenner became famous for inventing it. They took pus from mild smallpox sores and exposed healthy people to it deliberately to build immunity. It was risky, sometimes fatal, but it worked far more often than doing nothing, and it spread along trade routes from China to the Ottoman Empire to Africa, all before modern medicine even existed as a concept. So if ancient humans had no germ theory, no anesthesia, and no antibiotics, how did they keep figuring out solutions that science would later prove correct? The answer lies in something far more powerful than any textbook. Thousands of years of brutal, deadly trial and error passed down generation after generation like sacred code. And in part 2, we're going deeper into the terrifying surgeries they actually survived, the battlefield medicine that shaped entire empires, and one ancient remedy so effective that doctors still can't fully explain why it works. You think a broken bone is bad? Try this. Ancient battlefield surgeons amputated limbs using nothing but a sharpened blade, boiling oil, and sheer speed, and somehow soldiers walked away alive. Roman military doctors, known as Medici, were so skilled at battlefield trauma care that some of their wound-closing techniques and surgical tools barely changed for the next 1,500 years. They understood something startlingly modern. Speed saves lives. A skilled Roman surgeon could amputate a crushed limb in under a minute, because they had already figured out that shock and blood loss killed more soldiers than the wound itself. They packed wounds with vinegar-soaked cloths, a primitive but surprisingly effective antiseptic, since the acidity slowed bacterial hal growth. Long before anyone understood what bacteria even were, Meanwhile, across the world in ancient India, a physician named Sushruta was doing something almost unbelievable for his time, reconstructing noses. Soldiers and criminals who lost their noses in battle or punishment received what we now recognize as the earliest form of plastic surgery, using skin grafted from the forehead, a technique so refined that modern rhinoplasty still references his methods over 2,600 years later. He also performed cataract surgery using a curved needle to dislodge the clouded lens, restoring sight to people who otherwise would have lived the rest of their lives blind. These weren't lucky guesses. Sushruta documented over 300 surgical procedures and 120 surgical instruments in written texts, creating what many historians call the first systemized surgical manual in human history. But survival wasn't only about surgery. It was about understanding the invisible enemy long before anyone could see it. During the Black Death in medieval Europe, when nobody knew germs existed, certain communities still managed to slow the spread of plague using an idea that seems oddly modern: isolation. Venice forced incoming ships to anchor offshore for 40 days before anyone could disembark, a practice called quarantina, which is exactly where the word quarantine comes from. They didn't know about viruses or bacteria, but they noticed a pattern. Sickness traveled with people, so keeping people apart slowed the dying. This same instinct for pattern recognition saved entire civilizations from extinction. In ancient Rome, engineers built complex sewage systems and aqueducts, not fully understanding germ theory, but understanding clearly that clean water meant fewer deaths, and dirty water meant disease. The Romans drank from lead pipes, yes, which caused slow poisoning over decades, but their prevention with separating waste from drinking water single-handedly prevented countless outbreaks that would have devastated cities of hundreds of thousands of people. Even pain management, something we assume needed modern pharmaceuticals, had ancient solutions that worked. Sumerians, over 4,000 years ago, were already cultivating the opium poppy and documenting its pain-relieving properties on clay tablets, calling it the joy plant. This wasn't reckless drug use, it was calculated medicine, used specifically for surgery, severe pain, and even childbirth, with dosages refined over centuries of careful observation. So somehow, without laboratories, microscopes, or scientific journals, ancient civilizations on completely different continents were independently discovering anesthesia, antiseptics, reconstructive surgery, and disease control. And the most chilling part? Many of these methods were lost, forgotten, or dismissed as primitive superstition by later generations, until modern scientists rediscovered the same conclusions centuries later and called it innovation. In Part 3, we uncover the ancient remedy that modern doctors still cannot fully replicate, the medical mystery hidden inside a 5,000-year-old mummy, and the disturbing reason why some ancient treatments were actually more effective than what came after them. In 1991, hikers discovered a 5,300-year-old mummy frozen in the Alps, and what scientists found tattooed on his body left them stunned, because those tattoos were placed precisely on his joints, exactly where modern acupuncture points exist today. Otzi the Iceman, as he came to be known, had over 60 tattoos clustered around arthritis-damaged joints in his knees, ankles, and lower back, suggesting that ancient Europeans were using a form of pain relief therapy strikingly similar to acupuncture, thousands of years before it was documented in China. This single discovery shattered the assumption that ancient pain treatment was random superstition. It showed calculated, repeated, targeted application based on observed results. And Otzi wasn't just tattooed. He was carrying birch fungus, known to have natural antibiotic and anti-parasitic properties, almost like a prehistoric first aid kit tucked into his pouch. He knew exactly what to bring, and exactly where on his body needed treatment. This wasn't an isolated genius. This was inherited knowledge, refined by countless people before him who survived just long enough to pass it on. Speaking of inherited knowledge, ancient Andean civilizations were performing successful skull surgeries with a survival rate that, according to some studies, was actually higher than battlefield head surgeries performed during the American Civil War, thousands of years later. Think about that for a second. Surgeons with stone tools, no anesthesia beyond coca leaves, and no understanding of infection were outperforming surgeons with metal scalpels and basic hospitals separated by thousands of years of progress. How is that even possible? The answer is uncomfortable, but important. When survival depends entirely on getting it right, knowledge doesn't get diluted, ignored, or replaced by ego. It gets perfected through brutal necessity, generation after generation, with zero tolerance for failure. Meanwhile, ancient Andean and Egyptian communities were independently chewing coca leaves and willow bark, both of which contain compounds we now recognize as the chemical ancestors of modern cocaine-based anesthetics and aspirin. They didn't know the chemistry, but they absolutely understood the effect, and they refined dosages over centuries through careful, repeated observation passed down through oral tradition and ritual. Even childbirth, one of the most dangerous events in ancient life, had structured survival systems. Midwives across nearly every ancient culture, from Egypt to Mesopotamia to indigenous America, developed specific birthing positions, herbal mixtures to control bleeding, and even rudimentary forceps-like tools carved from wood and bone, refined over thousands of years of trial and devastating error. So here's the uncomfortable truth this entire journey has been building toward. Ancient humans didn't survive because they were lucky. They survived because survival itself was the only feedback loop they had. There was no Google, no textbook, no safety net, only results. If a treatment didn't work, people died, and the knowledge died with them. But if it worked, it was remembered, refined, ritualized, and protected like sacred fire, passed from healer to apprentice for thousands of years until it became civilization's silent foundation. Modern medicine likes to imagine itself as humanity's savior, rising from total ignorance. But the truth is far more humbling. We didn't invent medicine. We rediscovered it, piece by piece, dressed in lab coats instead of animal skins, often taking credit for wisdom that was already ancient before our oldest universities were ever built. And the next time you take an aspirin, get a vaccine, or watch a surgeon save a life, remember this. Somewhere, thousands of years ago, in a cave, a jungle, or a frozen mountain pass, someone already knew.